Well, so we have spent the bulk of today looking at Austin and Texas statewide, but as Ben just said, there's a very big United States out there. So we're going to bring this conversation to look more holistically across the states. And Jamie, who's with the National Association of State Chief Administrators, is here to help us do that. So Jamie, talk to us about NASCA, who your members are, and their role in workforce issues.
Yeah, excellent. And thank you guys so much for having us. We have covered so much ground today and some really national trends that we've seen at NASCA. So NASCA is this association that represents state chief administrators. And so that's the role around the United States of the business arm of government. And this is state government. So those are the people, the cabinet level official that reports up to the governor that usually oversees IT, procurement, HR, fleet, facilities. Typically, you'll see that this person called the chief administrator, the CAO, the COO, and that's who our members are. And so last year we did No problem. And so, do you want me to repeat that part, or?
Yeah, just go ahead.
So last year, what we did is we did a national survey of the state COOs and asked them some of the workforce trends and challenges they're seeing around the country. And so so a lot of these trends we've already talked about, and then I'm going to mention some trends that we haven't already talked about. We've talked a little bit about telework. And so in that survey, we found that 40% of states offer telework full time. And about 60% of states offer some form of telework. And so if that's not something you're already talking about, there's lots of public sector of your peers that are talking about telework. Another thing I heard a lot about was simplifying the process. And so we asked the national average to hire in the public sector isn't great. It takes about 73 days from the moment that you post a position to the moment that you hire a position, and that's the national average for states. And unfortunately, in local government, it's even higher. It's closer to about 101 days. And so that's something that we're really seeing the public sector look at is how do you simplify that process, especially where your state capital is in some of these, like in Austin or in Nashville, where you really have to compete for talent and getting that days to hire down. Another trend I heard was that brand, really focusing on the brand of the public sector. And so we're seeing some states do this really well. They're focusing on what other people have already talked about, interesting and varied work. Minnesota did a whole rebranding where one thing that they really focused on was the unified brand. And they have social media campaigns about interesting and complex, hairy challenges that they're solving. But also one thing that they focused on was all of the departments. There's, in the public sector, lots of different departments had different logos, different brands, different taglines. And so if I'm an employee trying to go into Minnesota state government and I don't realize that I could start as a facilities worker, I can then move over to be a manager in corrections, and then later on in my career, be a supervisor in parks. And so that's something that's really unique about the public sector is that ability to progress through a really large institution. So state governments, the median is about 40,000 employees with multiple different departments. And so that was a really interesting branding technique the state of Minnesota focused on was a unified brand for all the departments and how you could progress throughout state government. So they also did the interesting and varied work. Another really interesting thing that we're seeing in an upcoming study, and Texas talked about this a little bit, is something that state government is not doing really well in terms of attracting workforce, is thinking about the physical location that you're in. So I know our Guidehouse partners talked about where the coffee pot was located or where people are sitting, but that's not something typically the public sector has really thought about in terms of workforce, the physical location in where people want to be in. So those are some trends that people have already talked about. I'll talk about one more, and then I know we've got a whole list of questions. One thing that we really found in this survey is the time to act is now. And the reason is because there aren't on national average more government jobs today than there were before the recession. It's about the very similar, if not less, government jobs today than the recession. However, there is a significant amount of job postings. And so that's mostly due to turnover and retirement. So we're seeing that silver tsunami hit. We're seeing about a 19 to 20%, depending on the month when we pull numbers, increase of job postings today than there were before the recession. So there's more job postings. And then unfortunately, there's far fewer people applying to government jobs than there was before the recession. And so that's a pretty significant decrease in the number that we're seeing of people applying to the public sector, which is unfortunately then creating even bigger gap. So if we have more government job postings and fewer government jobs, we're seeing about a 50% gap in how much more difficult it is to attract people in the public sector. And so this, we kind of call it an alligator chart, is I think one of our big call to actions on it's now is the time to be bold in thinking about workforce at the public sector.
So, Jamie, the survey you mentioned is the results are captured in the Job 1 Reimagine Today's State Government Workforce Report. And I want to pick up on the last 2 points you made about the time is now and the far fewer applying. Let's start with the time is now piece. One thing your report talked about was states know this is a problem. We've talked about it ad nauseum today, and I'm sure this is very similar in the local government too. But they're not actually acting on it. So what do you attribute to that? And what do you hope what is maybe a motivating factor that maybe could change that dynamic?
Yeah, I think that there's always some challenges with the public sector. It can be very bureaucratic. There's funding. It's always harder to move the ship in a public sector than in the private sector. I also think there's the political component. So you have to get legislators and governors and council members and mayors to really understand that workforce should be a top priority in their policy agenda. And so you're seeing in this new wave of governors, public workforce is high on a lot of their priorities. When we analyzed their State of the State speeches. So I think that's where you need to make the case to your legislator, to the executive branch, and really elevating this issue. In state and in local governments, your workforce can make up to 70% of your budget. So this is the largest asset that public governments have. It's not always something that we think about the public sector. We are in the people business. Mm-hmm. And so rethinking about that, our largest asset, about our workforce and about our people.
So once they've kind of elevated this issue to their elected officials, senior leadership, what have you, so what's next? What should they start actually acting upon? What action step would you recommend?
And this was what's really great about when we interviewed the CAOs is because they understood the problem and they wanted to know how to fix this. Give us some state best practices, some benchmarking on where the states are doing this really well. Local governments are a little bit more nimble and are ahead of the state government in doing this. But when we polled, I think public sector has spent a lot of time on marketing and recruiting. We've talked about it a little bit where people are focusing on social media campaigns or the voice of the customer. An area we're seeing that they're not focusing as much attention on is in the employee engagement side and the retention side, and the succession planning side and the performance evaluation side. So that end of the employee life cycle, there's a lot of focus on marketing campaigns, not as much on once they're there, how are you keeping people? So we've already talked about some things you can do in terms of the marketing is really focus on that brand. And people have already talked about interesting and varied work. We haven't talked as much about progression. So really highlighting that you can come into public sector and you can move around. It's a big institution that you don't have to come in and start as you could work on a technology project for parks and then move over to do a technology part for police. So focus on that progression. Another way to really build the brand is to focus on training. So when we surveyed the private sector, they really see the role of training as the individual, where the public sector sees the role of training as they can provide training. So it's a unique selling opportunity is if you are providing training Earlier, the city of Austin was talking about some training that they're providing and how government can be a launch pad for your career. So you could kind of market that about, hey, come into government, get this training, and then go off and progress your career. And we've seen a couple states do that really well. Instead of focusing on lifetime employment, they're focusing on a launch pad. Michigan and Tennessee are really focusing on come in, grow your career here, and then leave. So there's kind of the recruiting piece. And then another part of the employee engagement piece, we already talked about training and succession planning. That's something to really start thinking through. When we surveyed our members, fewer than 30% of states were actively thinking about succession planning and how are you installing that institutional knowledge. That's another area to really start focusing on. Oregon has some really great toolkits out there. They developed a toolkit for all the departments. And so then it gives the flexibility and agility for departments to take that toolkit and apply it to, because it's going to look succession planning in corrections is going to look very different than succession planning in social services. So they can take that toolkit and then do succession planning in their departments. So those are a couple of ways states are starting to tackle the issue.
So let's talk about the other piece you brought up about the far fewer applying, because it sounds like there's a lot of efforts being done to build the brands and really make it attractive. But what, maybe in Minnesota or what other states that you looked at, how are they helping to increase the amount of people they actually see in who are applying to the jobs that they have posted?
Yeah, so we're seeing more of the marketing campaign. We're also seeing there's some really interesting tools out there now to attract. I know some people have talked about some tools. Some of these are some private sector vendors that are starting to use AI to filter out people applying for jobs. Also doing a really good job of attracting. We're seeing it rise up for diversity and inclusion in states, and so how you could use these tools to really target people of color into state government. So I'm starting to see that, some new tools for recruitment. And then there's still the traditional models of fairs, college fairs, but then also focusing on the voice of the customer. So creating that state voice of, for example, Louisiana did this really well. They created a short video as a day in a life of all the ways that you touch state government. So it was a short video about, your trash gets picked up in the morning, you see a sheriff, and it highlighted all the different and interesting ways in that short video that you touched government and all those different interesting components that make up a state government job.
So we talked about this in the earlier panel about collaborating across agencies, and you started talking about how some have just created one brand. So what opportunities are there for states to really work across all of their agencies to help solve this collective issue that they're having?
And so one thing that's interesting about state government is that in about a third of the states, the HR department, so the department that in charge of recruitment and retention, is centralized. And about a third of the states, it's decentralized. So each department is in charge of their own recruitment and retention. And so you don't have that unified message. So we are seeing that a trend to go more towards that unified HR model, so that I'm trying to think, Connecticut and Pennsylvania, for example, are ones that are now merging the HR departments to make sure that you can recruit, that an employee isn't someone who's trying to come into government isn't then having to fill out 8 different systems to get into government. Once they're there, they can kind of transfer throughout government. So I think that's one kind of trend we're seeing is them moving towards more of a centralized HR office. A trend that government has identified that they're not doing as well is that flexible and agile workforce, because government is unique. It kind of has traditionally these classification systems, and it makes it a little bit more difficult to have these very agile workforce. But we're seeing some states, as part of their succession planning, really focus on redesigning job functions. So you're thinking about how many jobs do we really need? What are the competencies that those jobs have? Do we have too many or too few jobs? And so they're focusing on redesigning the jobs, what you need in those jobs, how many jobs you have. And so that's their bigger picture succession planning, is what does your workforce look 10 years from now? How many people do you want in your workforce 10 years from now? Because technology, the pace of change is changing so rapidly, it's going to look very differently. And then kind of working their way back on redesigning the jobs and job descriptions for the people that they're hiring now.
A lot of what you're talking about is obviously about culture, which is very important when we think about the workforce of the future. They expect that to have a very flexible and agile workforce. And I know in the report, and you've brought up some examples today, but I'd like to spend a couple more minutes more specifically on some of you going a little deeper on some of the examples you provided in the report on the position descriptions, the time to hire, telework, because I think these are all things that people are exploring and testing. And so to kind of just talk a little bit more about people who have had success in this would be really helpful.
So I'll start out. One really interesting thing that we didn't focus this in the report, but I just heard this, is the state of Indiana just recently took job descriptions and job postings, and they did A/B testing. So they put a job posting out there on HR Specialist 3 with a typical government job that usually lists all of the things that you can't have done and can't have. You will be supervised, you will be drug tested, very early up in the job description, and then the normal job description. And they A/B tested it with a more simpler job description that actually said what they are doing. I'm not going to know what they are, but then a job posting that really identified the unique components of what they were doing. You will get to recruit diverse candidates into the state government, and you will be a chief learning officer. And they found a huge increase in the number of people that were applying to that job just based on the A/B testing. And so that's a really small pilot that you can start because government massive change can be hard. So some of those small A/B pilots can be interesting. Another thing that the state of Pennsylvania did is they did kind of similar to what someone mentioned earlier, is an in-state conference. So they had an in-state conference for all of the HR professionals where they really focused on some of these new trends in government, also knowing that you can start your career here and leave. So we're going to train you on future of work and AI and HR trends. That was a really interesting thing they did. They had that conference. They haven't done that in a while. Washington also has a really interesting mentorship program and progression program. So no matter what role that you come into, even if you come into as a maintenance worker, you will have a progression plan. So they're really focused on the growth of your career. So if you're a maintenance worker, you have a progression plan that you're going to end up in a couple years in facilities. You're going to grow your career here in the state. So I think that was a really interesting thing that they're doing. Any other ones that unique that you want me to hit on?
No, as you were talking, I was thinking about some of the other conversations we've had throughout today about bringing people to the table and having them discuss. And so I'm thinking about for new workers in state government, have you seen any states bring them in for a conversation to say, hey, what works for you here? What do you want to see? Are they bringing them in to have those conversations?
I definitely think that you're seeing some really innovative HR directors doing that. One thing that may hit on what you're saying is the state of Michigan has also gone to quarterly reports. So government is not known to have the best performance evaluations. They've switched to quarterly performance evaluations. They've also have brown bag lunches with management. They have town halls where you can come in and talk with management. They're really focusing on creating an employee-centric culture, and that's something that they've really elevated into executive leadership, is an employee-centric culture. Really making Michigan the ideal place to work. So you're seeing some of those, the brown bag lunches, the quarterly performance reports of people coming in and talking a little bit more.
And then the last point I want to hit on is what you brought up earlier is on succession planning. So how are, what examples are you seeing of states doing this well? How are they making sure that they're keeping that institutional knowledge? Something we talked about a couple of times today as well.
Yeah, and so every time I give this presentation on succession planning, I always get someone that raises their hand and said, well, it's so hard in government to do succession planning because you can't pick the next person to have that role. There's equal opportunity. We have to post the job. The job has to be out there for so long. So yes, succession planning looks a little bit different in the public sector, but we're seeing some states, like I mentioned, Oregon and Washington, start to do this really well. And they're really focused on building the pipeline. So what we heard them say is, I have an amazing A team, I have an amazing C team, the entry-level workers that have been here for a couple years, but I don't have people ready to fill the management role. And so they're focusing as succession planning on giving you kind of that broad, go learn about a bunch of different departments, go learn some management techniques on filling that management leadership pipeline. Something that's also kind of unique that we constantly heard in public sector is because there wasn't that middle level people ready to move up into the leadership role, is that we have elevated the best transactional leader into a management role. And transactional leaders don't always make them best transformational leaders. They don't know how to manage people. And so we were talking to a state about how they are still elevating transactional leaders, people who know the nuts and bolts and the technology of the job. So you can still be elevated without folk really, and they have a transformational leader. So you know how to manage people. And they've really made that distinction between the two. And so sometimes in government, we're left with, okay, you've been here the longest. We're going to elevate you up into the role. You don't know how to manage people. And so I think that's another interesting thing to focus on is the difference between the two types of leaders in that leadership pipeline.
For sure. So let me see if we have any questions from our audience. And please wait for a mic if you have a question.
So I was interested to hear you talk about succession planning in state government, and I want to be sure that folks in the audience are aware. In Texas, large state agencies are legislatively required to develop, write, update a workforce plan. So our workforce plan serves as our blueprint or our succession plan at the Environmental Commission. It's actually an addendum to the strategic plan. So any one of us can go on our website and take a look at that. One of the things that I like that we've done, and we've been doing this for a couple of bienniums now, we're focusing from a succession planning strategic standpoint on skills and competencies. So we're looking, we're projecting, we're envisioning, what are these skills and competencies that we need to help drive state government into, the next biennium, the next century. I think one of the challenges we're encountering is to allow, and I guess this is my perception, to what degree do we allow that blueprint to be flexible enough so that we are agile in state government? Because conceivably, we've got students who are graduating from college with degrees who will be hired for positions that we haven't even conceived of and are going to be performing skills that we haven't even imagined. So any thoughts on that?
Well, that's excellent to hear about this succession planning. You're kind of far and ahead of some states who don't have the succession planning. And I also really liked focusing on the competencies instead of the roles. What are those skills that you need? I would highly emphasize the need to be flexible and be agile, because you would hate for you to have written in, codified into an ordinance or law that you have to know robotic processing automation, and then in 3 years the pace of change has changed so much that something else is now the skill and competency. So I echo everything that you guys are doing, and then kind of just to add on having some of that flexibility on what are the new skills coming up. How often is that updated? Okay, so relatively often you guys are kind of looking at those skills and competencies. So it sounds like a pretty good model, and then just being able to really keep in touch with what is a need, and then adding those on to the succession plan.
Well, then I will ask one last question of you, Jamie, and it's when you look a year ahead, what do you hope to see states to start doing more of to address the challenges that they're facing in workforce?
Yeah, so I kind of thought about this question into 3 big buckets. So we're a year from now, and I've already kind of discussed states and public sectors doing a really good job on the marketing and the recruitment. So I'll kind of focus on some other buckets that are the upcoming trends. The first is that succession planning, we've already talked a little bit about, but really thinking about those job roles and which of those job roles will need to be redesigned, the job descriptions will need to be rewritten, the jobs that won't exist. And so thinking through the more strategic HR of the workforce you want 10 years from now, and how you can work your way backwards into what you're posting now. So I think that's succession planning, and then as part of succession planning is thinking about designing new job roles. What was interesting when we asked both the private sector and the public sector about redesigning job roles, private sector CEOs, almost all of them, 80% said they are redesigning job roles. And then when we asked the public sector, unfortunately, there were far than 20% of public sector are redesigning and rethinking job roles. So really that strategic HR. So that's the first big bucket. I think the second big bucket is the employee engagement side. So focusing on the training that you can offer, focusing on being the launch pad for someone's career. One thing that was interesting that a state had said to me was, traditionally the 2 big things that state offered was lifetime employment, so job security, and pensions. But what they're doing is they're refocusing, knowing that millennials and young people are looking for something slightly different, and they're shifting more to, instead of how can I keep a millennial from 1 to 2 years, how can I keep you for 3 to 5 years? Which even that 3 to 5 years is different than people coming into the public sector for that lifetime employment. So focus on that training, getting people in, and maybe also focusing on how are they going to progress their career. So is that in public sector, moving around, and also back to the recruiting side, highlighting the fact that they can move around, or highlighting the fact that they're going to progress their career outside of state and local government. So the employment engagement is the second big bucket I can see in the next year becoming a high trend. And the third one, this has been really popular at universities, and local government is doing a better job than than state government, is really focusing on a diverse workforce. You're seeing chief diversity officers be a high position in universities. That's a position that's happening in local governments. In state government, there are very few, kind of depending on how you classify it, 6 to 9 states have a chief diversity officer and really have efforts focused around having their workforce look like their workforce that the state is made up of. And then not only that, taking it to the next level and making sure that the diverse workforce is throughout every branch, and not only in maybe physically demanding jobs or other types of jobs, that making sure that you're also focusing on progressing their career in public sector. So those are my 3 big buckets.
Thanks, Jamie. And I encourage you all to, if you haven't already, check out NASCA's Job 1, Reimagine Today's State Government Workforce Report. It's really good. So that's all the time we have. So let's give a hand to Jamie.
Thank you.